Welcome to the webinar, The Advantages and Challenges of Clinical Trials. I'm Megan Claire Chase, Breast Cancer Program Director at SHARE. Before the presentation begins, I'd like to tell you a little bit about SHARE. SHARE is a national nonprofit that supports, educates, and empowers anyone who has been diagnosed with women's cancers and provides outreach to the general public about signs and symptoms, because no one should have to face breast, ovarian, uterine, cervical, or metastatic breast cancer alone. For more information about upcoming webinars, support groups, and our helplines, please visit our website at sharecancersupport.org. All participants will be muted during the presentation. When Dr. Teplinsky finishes presenting, we'll begin the Q&A discussion. You are welcome to submit questions during the presentation through the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. When asking questions, just remember, Dr. Teplinsky is unable to give specific medical advice, so please keep your questions general in nature. I also wanted to mention that closed captioning is available. You can enable this feature by clicking the live transcript button on the bottom of the screen and selecting the subtitle option. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the SHARE website soon. So now I would like to introduce our amazing speaker. Dr. Eleonora Teplinsky is a board-certified medical oncologist and the head of breast medical oncology at Valley Mount Sinai Comprehensive Cancer Care. She is a clinical assistant professor of medicine at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York. Dr. Teplinsky specializes in breast and gynecologic medical oncology. Her clinical and research interests focus on young women with breast cancer, survivorship, exercise oncology, and the use of social media in oncology. Y'all, her Twitter is like lit. She is passionate about oncology, education, and advocacy on social media, and is the host of the Interlude podcast, where she shares the stories and experiences of those who have been affected by cancer. So, Dr. Teplinsky, take it away.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. I am going to share my screen here. And let's see if this works. Okay, perfect. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And today I'm going to talk about the advantages and challenges of clinical trials. And clinical trials are really a wonderful resource, but it can be hard to figure out how to get involved in a clinical trial. And there's certainly some positives and sometimes some negatives as well. So we're going to talk about all of that, and then I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. So first, let's start just by talking about what clinical trials are. Clinical trials are research studies that are designed to find new ways to improve health. It's important to know that people volunteer to participate on clinical trials, and they evaluate and answer a whole host of questions. So they can ask things like, does this new treatment for a certain disease or condition work better than our current treatment? Does this new treatment or a lifestyle change, for example, reduce the chance of being diagnosed with a certain disease? So, if I drink less alcohol or exercise more, does that reduce my risk of getting diagnosed with breast cancer, for example? And can we test new ways of finding out if people have certain diseases? And we're seeing a lot of this kind of research and looking to see if people have a recurrence of their cancer through novel blood tests and things like that. So really a wide variety of questions that can be asked and different ways of studying those questions. There are 3 types of clinical trials, and I think this is important because very often if you are, being offered a trial, people will kind of just throw a lot of that language out at you. So I think really being empowered to know what those terms mean can be really helpful. So phase 1 trials, and I'll show you a diagram of this in a second, but phase 1 trials are your first kind of in-human trials. So the drug has been studied preclinically. It looks good. It's we think it's going to work. Now we bring it into patients. So this is looking at how often should the drug be given? What's the dose that should be given? What dose is safe, right? Because you can give it at multiple doses, but we want to make sure that we're not causing significant side effects. And, really most importantly, is this safe to be given in people? So those trials are going to have a small number of people. They're very meticulously designed because, again, the priority is first and foremost safety. Phase 2 trials are going to be giving a little bigger. So now we know that, okay, the drug is safe. And now we want to know, well, does it work? And we think it's going to work, but we don't know. And that's where the clinical trial comes into place. So we give it to a larger group of people with a certain disease, and we look at both side effects and a preliminary measure of efficacy. So how well does the treatment work, either compared to a placebo or compared to a standard of care medication? And then phase 3 trials are the next, and these are big, big studies. So we now learn from phase 2, look, this drug continues to be safe, and there's some measure of efficacy, meaning this drug is effective. Now we want to say, well, let's look at it in hundreds of people and figure out, is it better than standard of care? Is it the same, but maybe it has less side effects? Is it better than placebo? So those are all the questions that we're answering. So we start really, really small number of people, and we work our way up. This is a nice graphic from the National Institutes of Health that looks at all the stages. So on your left, you're going to see preclinical. So this is first done in cell lines, then in mouse models, and we start seeing, again, preclinically, before we bring it to the clinic, is this drug safe and effective? Then we go into phase 1. So this is going to be, again, our smallest study. So the drug's now been approved for testing in humans. We're looking at safety. Then we're moving to phase 2. Again, you can see a little bit bigger in terms of numbers. We're going to look at still safety, but efficacy. And then phase 3 is a big study. Now, this says 1,000 to 3,000 participants, but sometimes in our cancer studies, we do have less patients than that, especially kind of for more rare cancers. And then at this point, if phase 3 study says, yes, this is good, then the drug is submitted for FDA approval. FDA spends a while reviewing. They want to confirm both the safety and the efficacy of the medication, of course, and then it gets approved. And then sometimes they'll have these phase 4 studies, which is basically kind of looking at that drug once it's approved and used outside of a clinical trial, kind of in real time, and looking at, is it doing what we think it should do based on our phase 1, 2, and 3 trials? And kind of I like this graphic a lot because it shows the life cycle of clinical research. And when you look and you think, okay, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, how long can this take? It takes a really, really long time. And sometimes we all get frustrated at the slow pace, but there's a lot that goes into it. And so we start here with at the top with our research question and study design. So let's say I'm talking about triple negative breast cancer. And my question is, how do I improve survival? How do my patients with triple negative breast cancer live longer? Is there a marker or drug that we can study? So then you have this analysis of what's out there, what drugs are in development, what can we study? Are there any markers that we can target? Things like that. Then you have to come up with the design. You have to obtain funding. Clinical trials are not cheap to do. You have to have it reviewed. You have to make sure it's ethical to do, right? So this is important because we're not going to give people a brand new drug when something really effective is already available. Then the study gets registered. It gets registered with the government. Then the study itself is conducted. We collect all the data. We check for updates. Then you do the data analysis and report the results, and then we're back here. So this whole process takes a long time. And I'm going to show you now how it happened for a particular drug. So Trastuzumab deruxtecan is also known as Enhertu. A lot of us might have heard about this recently because it was presented at the ASCO 2022 annual meeting. But Trastuzumab deruxtecan is a type of drug called an antibody drug conjugate. And right now it is FDA approved for HER2 positive metastatic breast cancer. And I just want to show you how we got there. So this is from the phase 1 trial. And what's important to highlight here is that the study was conceived earlier than 2015, but that's when they enrolled their first patient. So between August 28, 2015 and 2018. So it took 3 years to do this study, and they had about 100 patients here. And so this is, again, just looking at safety and what's the right dose. And the conclusion at the bottom was that it had a manageable safety profile. So that's phase 1. Next, we want to bring it to phase 2. Okay, so this is the publication of the phase 2 study. And they kind of go into, what they did here, but in this top box here, they say in the first part of the study, we evaluated different doses to establish a recommended dose. And then in the second part, we evaluated the efficacy and safety of the recommended dose. So now we're presenting on the efficacy part. So here it's a little bit bigger, 184 patients. And again, they gave that recommended dose and they look at efficacy. And so in the conclusions, they say it shows durable anti-tumor activity. So this is saying, look, we gave it to a bigger number of people and it works. And now let's really look at it in a bigger scale. And this is the phase 3 study. And so time is continuing to go on. So that prior study was in 2018, 2019. Now we're in 2019, 2020. And here they did phase 3. So again, a bigger study, randomized, meaning half the patients were getting this new drug, Trastuzumab deruxtecan, and half were getting Trastuzumab emtansine or Kadcyla, which is a known approved antibody drug conjugate in this space. And they split the patients, half got one, half got the other. And they looked, and here they had 524 patients, and they looked to see how well they did on the drug. And this drug was effective. It was more effective than Trastuzumab emtansine. And so based on that, that led to the FDA approval. Now, the way that FDA approvals work for drugs is first they have early data, and they give it kind of accelerated approval, meaning, hey, this early data is really promising and we want to get it to patients. We don't want to keep this from patients if it's working. But then they say, great, we'll approve it for you, but we need to see the final data. We need to see the full study completed before we'll give it full approval. So the drug got accelerated approval back in December of 2019. So that's when we started to use it and then think about using it. And then just in May of this year, it got full approval, basically saying, look, the data all pans out, it's safe, it's effective, and we're going to give it its full stamp of approval to use. So this process takes a long time. It can take anywhere from 10 to 15 years to complete all 3 phases of clinical trials before FDA approval. A lot of it depends on so many factors, but one of the challenges is because it takes a long time, sometimes what happens is there's new drugs approved during that time. And so the studies then don't become as relevant, or like you can't accrue as many patients because there's a new drug. So there's so many hurdles and barriers that can happen. It's also about finding patients to go on the study. And it's really important that to know this number. So less than 10% of drugs that enter phase 1 trials ultimately get FDA approved. So there's a lot of drugs being funneled into phase 1, but most of them don't make it through the whole process. I think an important topic is talking about patient safety in clinical trials. And this slide will be here for your reference, but the important point is that there are 3 groups that make rules for clinical trials in the United States. First is institutional review boards. So I have a study, I've written it up, I have the drug, and now I have to bring it to a group of experts that are going to look at it with, every single word they look at in that 100-page protocol. And they're going to tell me, yes, we agree that the trial is correct. It is safely and fairly designed. And so the IRB, their goal is to protect the clinical trial volunteers. They work for the patients. They want to make sure that this is safe. And it has to be, the drug study has to be approved by the IRB before it can begin. Then for things that are looking at new drugs, it's going to go to the FDA. The FDA has to approve any studies with experimental drugs or medical devices. And then after it's approved and the study begins, periodically you will go to the Data and Safety Monitoring Board. and also known as the DSMB. And this is a periodic check throughout the life cycle of that trial to make sure that it's safe. And sometimes they'll say, yes, it's safe, or, there have been a number of adverse events on the study, and we recommend that the study actually stop because it's not safe. So that does happen as well. A really, really important point is talking about diversity in clinical trials. This is actually a huge commitment for ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, to improve this. And the reason this is a big issue is that in general, participation in clinical trials is very low. So only, and we're talking about cancer, but 2 to 8% of US adults participate in clinical trials in the US. And the patients that go on trials tend to be younger, they tend to be healthier, and they do tend to be less racially and ethnically and geographically diverse than the people we see with cancer in the clinic. And this is a huge issue because how can you take the results of a study and apply it to the general population when you didn't test it in the general population, when your population that you tested it in is not representative of the people that are actually going to get it. And the statistics are really sobering. So only 4 to 6% of trial participants are Black, and 3 to 6% are Hispanic, despite the fact that they represent 15 and 13% of patients with cancer respectively. And honestly, that number of trial participants may be even lower because only a third of cancer studies report race and ethnicity data, which is really a big issue because we have to report these numbers so that we can start to figure out how to improve them. And there are barriers at every level. There are barriers at the clinician level, at the patient level, at the clinical trial level, at the institutional level. So it's a big, big factor. And I'm really proud of ASCO that they are starting to really commit to this topic and really starting to see how can we improve participation. And this is their joint research statement that was published again by ASCO and the Association of Community Cancer Centers. And I just want to draw your attention. The document is linked here, and it's wonderful, fantastic work. They have a number of recommendations, but I really thought this top one was really important. And their recommendation is that clinical trials are an integral component of high quality cancer care, and every person with cancer should have the opportunity to participate. And I think that this top line is key because the current system does not support equitable access to and participation in cancer trials. New institutional commitment is needed to provide broader or more equitable access to trials for people from racial and ethnic minority populations. And this is a big, big statement. And I'm really excited to see what they come up with in terms of starting to combat and break down some of these barriers. Now, talking about their statement that clinical trials should happen at all stages of cancer. There's this very common misconception that clinical trials are only for, and I wrote metastatic breast cancer, but just say metastatic cancer in general, that they're only for metastatic cancer when there's, quote, no other treatments or options left. And I will say that is when more often clinical trials are discussed. But that is wrong because clinical trials are important and necessary in all stages of cancer. Every single drug that we use, starting with stage 1 to stage 4, was tested in a clinical trial. And so we have to have participation and volunteers so that we can, improve treatments at all stages, improve survival rates, and improve quality of life. And a cancer clinical trial may be a treatment option for every single person who has received a cancer diagnosis. Now, very often we do start out testing our drugs in metastatic or stage 4 cancer. And then if we see that they're effective there, then we'll move them to earlier stages of treatment. So that Trastuzumab deruxtecan example I gave you, it's right now approved in metastatic breast cancer, but there are studies now looking at it in stage 2 and stage 3. So you can see we're moving it earlier on. What are the advantages of a clinical trial? Aside from the fact that you're contributing to science, you as a participant have access to a new treatment that is not available to people outside of the clinical trial, or an existing treatment like, let's say, Trastuzumab deruxtecan that's being studied in a new way or a new stage. a lot of times people will say, well, if I don't go on the study, can I still get the drug? And you can't, because it's not FDA approved for that purpose at that time. So you have access to a new treatment. Number two, you have additional monitoring by the research team. And I can't stress this enough. When you go on a trial, not only do you have your oncologist and everyone who works with your oncologist, you also have a research team. You have a research nurse and a study coordinator, and they are on top of you, meaning they are following up, they're answering your questions, they're double checking, triple checking everything. So I think it's just extra monitoring, which is really helpful. Now, if the treatment ends up being more effective than the standard treatment or placebo, you are one of the first to benefit from it, which is always nice. And again, it helps us learn more about cancer. And I want to say here that even if a study is negative, so meaning let's say you go on a trial and the new drug does not show benefit, we've still learned about that. We learn from every single study that we do, whether the results are positive or negative. Now, what are the risks? Now, first and foremost, that new treatment may not be better, right? That's what we're looking at. So it could maybe equal, or it could even be worse than standard treatment. But that's where that data safety monitoring board comes into play, because they're periodically doing these safety analyses and efficacy analyses. And if they say, wait a second, we're not seeing, improvement here, they again may choose to terminate that study early. The new treatment may have unexpected or severe side effects. Clinical trials do tend to be more time consuming in terms of how often you have to come for appointments and tests, and how long you have to spend at the cancer center, especially in our early studies, the ones that are the phase 1s and phase 2s. Very often you need additional tests such as biopsies, so it can be a lot. And the other kind of challenge is that the phase 1 studies very often tend to be done in academic centers, and those may not be close to your house. Those are your kind of big cancer centers that we think about. So there may be travel involved. You may even have to relocate. And there's a big push since COVID in making clinical trials accessible for everyone, even if they're not at an academic center, and trying to figure out how we can streamline a lot of this testing so that people can stay at home, go to their local center, their local lab, rather than having to trek into a big institution, multiple times a week. So this is a very important question. How do I find a clinical trial? So the first step always is to ask your team, hey, am I eligible for a clinical trial? Now, sometimes, people will say, well, no one told me. And a lot of times it wasn't discussed, partly because there's no trial available, or there is a trial, but you're not eligible. And so your doctor just didn't bring it up because it's not applicable. But so that's why it's really important to ask specifically, am I eligible for a trial? I will tell people, I really make it a point to try to tell every single new patient that I see that we have trials available. There's nothing that's available for your particular stage or tumor type right now, but at least you've had that conversation. Now, sometimes maybe your cancer center does not have a trial, but a different institution nearby may have a trial. And so that's why saying, am I eligible? Is one available? Really opens the door for this conversation. And often it doesn't happen. And I think even if you're not eligible for a trial right now, at least you knowing about it is good, because maybe down the road, if you need one, that's already in your brain. And so in the end, you may not go on a trial, but it's important to know, number one, all the resources are available to you. I also think it's important to know what research questions are being looked at in your particular cancer type. Let's say you're being recommended to get chemotherapy for ovarian cancer, and there's a new study that you're not eligible for, but it's looking at immunotherapy with chemotherapy. It's helpful to know that that's what's being studied, because maybe in the future, if that gets approved when you would have heard about it, maybe you could benefit from it later. Where can you look for a trial? So aside from just asking your oncologist, the best site is clinicaltrials.gov. This is a governmental website. It is a database of all the privately and publicly funded clinical studies around the world. And typically we say privately, we do mean pharmaceuticals, but sometimes they're grant funded as well. And here you go on their website and you can do kind of a basic search. So I can just type in, let's say, breast cancer and maybe immunotherapy, or I want to type in New York if I'm looking for a breast cancer study in New York. And if you do an advanced search, you can really filter by, you can go as narrow as I want a phase 3 trial in New York City that is actively accruing and looking at this type of drug. Now this website's not the easiest to use, I will say, but it's a start. And what I always encourage people to do is play around with it and then bring it to your oncologist and say, hey, found a couple, what do you think about it? Another place is through the National Cancer Institute. So these are just studies that the NCI supports, but you can find some here as well. And here you can filter by zip code, which I like because you can find stuff that's right next to you. And they've got a live chat here that's very helpful. So let's say you find a trial, you're like, oh, this looks great, this is promising, I have stage 2 cancer, it's a stage 2 cancer study. The next question is, are you eligible? Now, every clinical trial has strict criteria, which include, but is not limited to, you have to have a certain stage or type of cancer, you have to have received or not received specific cancer treatments. Some studies will look, let's say, for a BRCA mutation, so specific genetic or molecular changes, your medical history. If you have, let's say, diabetes, maybe that's an exclusion criteria, things like that. And then your current health status. So you do have to be pretty healthy to go on a study. Questions to ask your team. So let's say you're with your oncologist and they are recommending a trial for you. So I have a list of questions here that I think is helpful. And I'm not going to go through every single one, but I think the goal that I want you to talk to your doctor about is for you to understand, why is this study being done? Why do you think it's good for me? How is it different than standard of care? So what would I get if I didn't go on this study? And what are the requirements? Because very often people say, oh, the study looks great, it's a new drug, it's really promising, and then all of a sudden it turns out that you have to be there 3 times a week, and that's not something that is working for you. So I think understanding how the study is done, what the requirements are, I think knowing who is sponsoring and funding the trial is important. And then what are the possible benefits and risks of participating in this trial? And this is where we get at the side effects of a particular drug. And then continued, so what are the logistics, frequency of visits? What are my responsibilities as a patient? Are there tests, are there procedures, are there scans that are needed? And how is that different than standard of care? Who will be the medical staff involved in my care? I think this is really important, kind of going into that. We get that whole research team, but who is on that research team? Privacy concerns, who will know that I'm participating? Can I talk to others on the study? Will I get the results of the study? And I think the question of, can I talk to others on the study is really important, because let's say you're hearing about a study and you're not sure, like, is it right for me? And you want to talk to somebody who's already participating to find out, well, what's been their experience? And so that's something that you want to ask your oncologist about. Can you connect me with someone on the study? And then ultimately also what costs are involved. So what does the trial cover? A lot of trials will cover scans, the drug costs, but there's still things that they don't always cover. So for example, copays. So if you need more frequent visits and the copayment for that visit is not covered, it may be a big expense. So these are things to really know upfront. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to answer any questions that have come in.
Woo! Dr. Teplinsky, we have got a lot of questions for you.
I'm ready.
That was fantastic. That was fantastic. So I'm going to try and cover as many of them as I can, but we may not be able to get to all of them due to time constraints. But here I go. So I'm gonna get with the ones that were submitted live and those that were submitted prior to. So you did go over about like this one. She says, my oncologist says I have to find a clinical trial on my own, and is there any place to get help? And I know you did answer that part with the clinicaltrials.gov and the National Cancer.
National Cancer Institute, and you can Google those. I will say though that if your oncologist is telling you you have to do it on your own, that's a little bit of a concern for me, because I want you to feel comfortable talking to your oncologist. And so that's something that, maybe they want you to search and then bring the studies, and you're going to talk about them. But the key is that you really want to make sure you have that collaborative conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. So if you already have metastatic cancer, but current treatment is going well, should you just stick with the current treatment until it stops working, or should you be more aggressively pursuing clinical trials?
So that is a great question. Now, here's the thing. Most trials, you have to be progressing on your current treatment or not tolerating your current treatment in order to go on a study. So basically, you'd say you're on a drug and it's working, and at some point maybe it stops working, then that's when you would consider a trial. You do want to be proactive, because one of the things that people don't always talk about is that, let's say you get a scan and the scan shows that your cancer is progressing and you want to think about a clinical trial. It takes weeks to enroll onto a trial. So I always like talking up front and saying, right now this is what we're doing, but should there be progression, here are some options for clinical trials. So we're thinking about it ahead of time. But if a drug is working, I would not recommend switching until it stops working or you have side effects.
Thank you. Let's see. I'm gonna go to this question because I want to make sure I try and capture all of our different disease areas that are asking questions. What are the best trials right now for ovarian cancer, or where should one look for trials specific to ovarian cancer? Would that be the clinicaltrials.gov?
Clinicaltrials.gov, there is a lot of new drugs being tested in ovarian cancer, which is really exciting, because for years we didn't have anything. And so the big molecule that everyone's really looking at is antibody drug conjugates. So that's the Trastuzumab deruxtecan that I talked about. That's an antibody drug conjugate. And there's a couple that are being studied, different ones, but that mechanism is being studied in ovarian cancer. So clinicaltrials.gov is going to be your best bet of seeing what is available for you for your exact particular stage and type.
Thank you. All right. Let's see. We have some, this is going to be like a little multi-layered question here. So first, are any trials recommended for those while in remission? We have someone who's been NED, and that means no evidence of disease. For those that don't know what NED means, for 11 months. Could that person still be involved in a trial in remission?
Yes, so it depends, again, very nuanced, but there are studies that are looking at medications or some vaccine studies, looking at ways to reduce the risk of a recurrence, a maintenance therapy. So there's lots of different options. The challenge is, again, a lot of them will say you have to be, X amount of time out. So, yes, definitely worth looking at. And again, I would start with clinicaltrials.gov and calling your oncologist and saying, hey, just want to check in. Is there any study you are aware of, whether at your hospital or nearby, that might be good for me?
Thank you. All right, we got some more. So put your hat on. So another question that kind of goes along with that. So with clinical trials, do you have to pay to be in a clinical trial? And what about traveling? And then what happens if you're on a clinical trial, it's working? Do you then have to pay for it once it gets approval?
So yeah, every study is different. So it really depends on who is funding the study. So for example, studies that are funded by the National Cancer Institute or the NIH tend to have a little bit less financial support than pharmaceutical studies. But for example, so if a drug is not FDA approved, the study has to pay for the drug, because your insurance, because it's either the study pays for it or your insurance pays for it. Okay. So if the insurance say, well, this is not approved, we're not paying for it, so the study has to pay for it. Any scan, so if, let's say, normally you get scans every 3 months, that will be billed to insurance. Whereas if the study says, well, no, we want you to get scans every 6 weeks, the study should pay for that. So it's kind of a balance between what your insurance will cover and what the trial will cover. The hidden costs, like you said, are the transportation, right? The parking. I mean, a lot of these, you're going to big centers, there's $30 of parking per day, food, lodging, those kind of hidden costs, co-payments, right, for visits. So I think it's really important to be very upfront with the oncologist and the research team and say, what are my costs here? And a lot of times the studies will actually pay for parking for you, or they'll pay for like a meal voucher. So there are little things, but you shouldn't, as a patient on a study, you really shouldn't be paying more. And typically, even if a study concludes, if you're on the drug, let's say the study says we're done, we enrolled 500 patients, we're not open to new participants, they're not kicking you off the study. You will stay on the study and they will provide the drug to you for as long as it's working. So you don't have to pay for the drug once the study ends.
Oh, okay. It's good. It's good information there. All right. I have another question. What is the latest information on preventing recurrent endometrial cancer after brachytherapy? Am I saying that right?
So brachytherapy is a type of local radiation. And so it depends, again, it depends on the stage of the cancer. But there are some studies, for example, a big one is, again, this is a public, it's from the NRG, which is a big cooperative group that does studies. So there's a uterine cancer, endometrial cancer study looking at immunotherapy. So you get chemotherapy with immunotherapy. Some people get chemo and placebo, and then you may continue the immunotherapy. There are other drugs, again, with maintenance, but it's hard for me to say this study for you because I don't know all the nuances of your particular case. And so I think it's really just to come back. I think the goal here is to advocate for yourself and to really say, I'm interested in this. I found this online and I want to know if this is right for me.
Yes. You got to advocate for yourself. Another one here. How do you decide if phase one trials are appropriate? Are those more of a last chance when and if we run out of options?
So that's that's kind of what people think about it, but it's not. It depends on how the study is designed. So I can tell you, we have a phase 1 study for breast cancer, for metastatic breast cancer. And you get the standard of care. So you get what you'd normally get, but they're adding a new drug that they haven't looked at right in this combination before. The drug is already approved. It's just the combination that's new. So technically that's a phase 1 study because you're testing this combination, but it's done very early when someone's brand new diagnosed. So the point being is that it's not all the way at the end. It just depends on the drug and how it's being studied and in which combination.
Okay. Let's see. How do you know what your markers and what trial is right for you? How important is the next level tumor test?
Yeah, so basically there's a lot of molecular testing being developed. And the idea is to look for mutations and markers that your cancer carries that maybe someone else's doesn't. And then the trials will target that mutation. So for example, let's talk about BRCA because a lot of people are familiar with the BRCA mutation. There are drugs for people who have a BRCA mutation. There are drugs, and if you don't have the mutation, you can't get that study for that drug. So those molecular tests are relevant. They differ for each cancer and for each stage. And so that's why it depends. But yes, certain studies will say you are eligible for the study if you have this mutation because we are testing a drug that targets this mutation. So then it becomes relevant. A lot of those studies will actually pay for you to get that testing done because so there's a lot of like pre-screening and things like that. So it gets really, really complicated. And the best advice I always give is I want everyone to be at a place where they feel comfortable having these conversations.
Right, exactly. All right, got more. Hold on.
I love it.
Okay. Here's a question. At a lower dosage and every other day, and wait, I'm not quite sure how to read that one. So I have to get back to that one. Hold tight. Why is it important to know who sponsors or funds the trial?
Well, I think so. I think it's important. I put this in there because I think knowing, again, one, if it's a more of a government study or a pharmaceutical company, kind of impacts the funding in terms of like what's paid for and what's not paid for. But it's also important. This, I think, is important when you're looking at results of studies. So, for example, we see a lot about, there was a study came out that said, oh, you should eat red meat. It's great for you. Well, who's funded? Who funded it? The meat industry, right? So there's always going to be some bias about, that kind of thing. So I think it's just an important fact to know. Again, a study about how milk is great for you. Well, if milk, if the dairy industry funded it, you just got to be think twice.
Good point. Excellent point. Let's see. If I was previously on a clinical trial and that trial closed due to lack of success, is there any way that I can find out if I was in the placebo arm or actually receiving the drug?
Great question. So some studies will, at the end of the study, unblind the participants, meaning you will get a letter and this is what you were on. So they either sometimes do this at the end, sometimes they don't, and they will tell you that you would know that up front. Like very often they have a plan for what they're going to do, but the study can always be unblinded. So for example, let's say someone has a significant side effect, or we need to know, so here, that study I was talking about with the immunotherapy for uterine cancer. I would need to know if someone was getting immunotherapy or not, because if they progress, I'd want to give them immunotherapy. So for certain situations, the study will let you unblind. There's always a way to do it, but routinely it's typically done at the end of the study and not for every single one.
It's a good new term to learn, unblind.
Blind.
Yeah, in that context. All right, so this is in the metastatic breast cancer realm here. In many, if not most phase 3 trials, overall survivability is the endpoint measured. So many individuals living with MBC get to a point in their treatment trajectory where overall survivability is a measurement for efficacy of a drug or treatment is less important than progression-free survival, since we are looking for tolerable treatments that will give us the best non-progression timeframe. Overall survivability is a noble measurement to pursue, but is there a reason why it is seen, even in terminal cancers, to be the most important measurement?
So there's different endpoints. So the two big ones are progression-free survival and overall survival. So a lot of studies will actually use progression-free survival as their primary endpoint. So what that means is, how long are you living without the cancer progressing? But overall survival is kind of the holy grail, because I want to know, by taking this drug, are you going to live longer, right? Like, yes, let's say you live longer without you're alive and the cancer hasn't progressed, but then if you progress and I give you something after that and you still live the same amount of time, doesn't really matter as much than me saying, wow, this drug, people live for 2, 3, 5 more years from being on this medication, regardless of what they got after. So ultimately, looking at survival, it's basically saying, if with metastatic cancer, we know that, again, it is a terminal illness, so people will die from that cancer. So let's say the average length of time someone is living, again, statistics, not individual, but statistics, are 5 years. Well, if I have a new drug that comes along and says, oh, no, now it's not 5 years anymore, now it's 7 years. Well, that's huge. Rather than saying, okay, you're going to be on this drug for 12 months, and that's 5 more months than a different drug. Cool, progression-free survival is improved, but you're still only going to live 5 years. That's not as important. I want to know, can you live 7 years? It's a nuanced answer, but I hope that is helpful. And I think the other part that we have to keep in mind is quality of life, because even if you are living longer or you're on the drug longer and the cancer hasn't progressed, but you're miserable, well, that's something we have to keep in mind as well.
And we all want that quality of life for sure.
Yeah,
Let's see. So this is another question submitted live. How do I approach my oncologist about a trial that looks like a fit? Like, how should that conversation go?
So I think you just say exactly that. I was doing some research and I came across a trial. I am interested in it. What do you think about it? And if you are not at a point where you can have that kind of conversation with your oncologist, that's not a place where you want to be. And this is where things like patient portals are really great, because a lot of it, you come in, we're really limited with time. Everyone is. And so if you have a 15-20 minute visit, well, there's a lot to get through. And so sometimes people feel like, oh my gosh, I didn't get all my questions answered. So either make another appointment, but that's a lot, right? It's expensive and all that, or patient portals. That's a great way to reach your team directly without having to like rush everything into one visit. And then the doctor can reply when they have a few minutes to sit down and think about it. So I think that I personally love messages through the portal, because it's like email, and it's a way for me to answer the questions outside of the visit. But I think you would just say that I'm interested in this study. What do you think about it? That's it.
Yeah. And plus, that'll always be part of your medical record too, of when you put that question into the patient portal. Okay. So, can clinical trials be conducted at the same time as the patient is receiving their current treatment?
So clinical trials are going to be your treatment at that point. So, for example, let's say you're getting chemotherapy, a clinical trial might look at that chemotherapy with another drug. So it's all going to be simultaneously. But if you're on a current treatment right now, it's not that easy to just add a trial on top of that.
Okay. Goodness, we have so many awesome questions for you. We are picking your brain. All right, let's see. Well, we have a comment here. We have a comment saying, it would concern me if I was in a clinical trial and incurring expenses and then find out that I was on a placebo. Is that really ethical for cancer patients?
So I think that's a great question, and I'll answer. I'll give you an example. So in stage 2 and 3 breast cancer, a couple of years, we had this study called the Monarchy study. It was looking at abemaciclib, which is a CDK4/6 inhibitor. Now that drug was already approved for metastatic breast cancer, and the researcher said, hey, if we give it early, after someone's done with their chemo and their radiation, and if we add it to their aromatase inhibitor, can we decrease the chance of their cancer coming back? Okay, so people were getting, let's say, Arimidex, okay, an anastrozole, and then either placebo or an anastrozole plus abemaciclib, right? So yes, you could have been on the placebo arm, but you weren't. It's not like you were still getting the standard of care. It was just 50% were getting standard of care and something more. And so it is ethical in the sense that you are aware of this. When you sign up for a trial, there's a 50% chance you can go on a placebo. And some people actually don't want to do that because it's exactly for this reason. They don't want to incur expenses, the extra visits, and they say, you know what, this is not for me. But other people say, I want to do what I can. If there's a chance that I can get a drug that could reduce my risk, I'm in. And so the ethical part would be if someone didn't tell you that, right? If they said, hey, you're going to get, and then it turns out you didn't get what you thought. But, the way clinical trials are very, correctly and ethically designed. And so, as a patient, you sign a 30-page consent form that says, I agree that I'm either getting placebo or a drug, and I won't know what I'm getting.
Okay. So it's really important that you read all of the paperwork that you're getting and then ask those questions to that research team or
Exactly.
Okay.
And just one thing about signing consent forms for trials, it's not like someone gives you a consent form and says, bring it back, sign off on the dotted line, see you later. we have to, as the research team, someone has to sit with you and go over that consent page by page by page. So that's yet another layer of making sure that you understand all of that fine print.
Another question. So say you're in the trial, you've gotten in, you've met all the criteria. What happens if you're like, you know what? I don't want to be part of this anymore. What happens?
You say, you just say this, I don't want to be part of it anymore. So not the consent forms are not contractual. They're not binding. You can always come off the study without any penalty. No one's going to make you pay back none of that. And every single clinical trial consent form has a paragraph in there about what you do. If you have concerns about the study at any time, about the safety, the efficacy, the ethics, any of that, or if you want to just come off the study, there's a number you can call 24 hours a day. So all of that has to be written into the consent form.
Excellent. All right. Make sure I'm trying to get to all the questions. All right. What do you think would be the most effective approach for metastatic breast cancer advocates, or anyone that has a metastatic advocates, to address this type of trial design that is not serving us?
So I'm not sure exactly what specific trial design, if it's just trial designs in general. The best thing I can do is really join support groups and advocacy groups. And that's where social media is really amazing, because you can connect with other people, other participants, other patients, and really start. There's so many fantastic advocacy groups that you can be a part of, and then really start to promote change. The nice thing is that institutions, clinical trial research, design people that come up with that study design, they're all starting to include patient advocates, which is amazing, because I want to know if I'm coming up with a study, I may think it's good, but I want to know, do patients think it's good, right? Because you might say to me, this is horrible. Are you kidding? And I'm blind, maybe I'm just not thinking about it. So the fact that we're getting patients at the table to really come up with this stuff is amazing. And I think if you want to get involved and you're not sure how, go to Twitter and just put it out there and say, hey, I'm interested. Someone will help you.
Yeah, y'all, Twitter, there's a major cancer space of support, information by amazing advocates and researchers and medical teams. So it really is a great place to learn and ask those types of questions. Say #MedTwitter if you have a question like that. Let's see. So has there been clinical trials done with CDK4/6 inhibitors that, when taken at lower dosage and every other day instead of daily? If so, what is the efficacy?
So all studies, so there's not really ones of every other day, but let me kind of answer this question a little bit more broadly. So when we talk about those phase 1 studies, remember I said we're trying to find the dosage that's the best dosage. So they will study something called the maximum tolerated dose. Okay, so let's say they'll look at 200 milligrams, 400 milligrams, 600 milligrams. And then they go up to 800, and that's too many side effects. So no. So they drop it down. And the goal of finding the maximum tolerated rather than the medium tolerated is that, so if you do have to dose reduce, you've got these levels that are still effective. Right. So that's why we go up as much as we possibly can. We push that dose. So that way, when you have to dose reduce, you still have levels that are effective. And so, yes, for CDK4/6 inhibitors, like with any other drug, there are going to be reduced dosages that happen a lot that are still effective. Abemaciclib is a type of CDK4/6 inhibitor, and actually that one, very often, that top dose does not work for most people, and you have to dose reduce, and it's still very, very effective.
And I think it's also important to communicate to your team that if you're having some sort of side effects or something, so they can know, maybe we need to adjust the dosage. Like there should be some communication, right?
Yeah, and don't be afraid. I think what happens, especially on trials, but not on trials as well, as people are sometimes afraid to bring up their side effects because they don't want to be taken off a medication that's working, right? Or they don't want to have to come off the study. And so sometimes they don't say anything or they underestimate their symptoms and it's not a lot of diarrhea. Meanwhile, you're not getting off the toilet, right? So the point being is that you want to be honest because it's really meant to help you, and a lower dose will still work and you're going to have a better quality of life.
Ooh. Preach. We want that better quality of life with all of this. Let's see. I think we'll take about 2 more questions. All right, this is a layered one here. So there are so many incredible stories published in the news about preclinical trial results. Should we be taking these with a grain of salt, or should we be tracking these to see if and when they enter phase 1 trials? And also, how long does it take to go from preclinical results to phase 1 trials?
So really great question. Very often you'll see on the news, like a study in mice or in cell lines was really, really promising. So obviously we get excited about it, right? Yes, a new option is coming, but most of those don't make it necessarily into phase 1, or the phase 1 stops prematurely for lack of efficacy or safety because we are not mice. And so when you put it in humans, different things happen. So I think it's all about what some people love tracking it. It's empowering for them and they love learning about it. And so go for it. Other people will wait and see. So it's all about what your needs are, but it does take a while for preclinical to get to phase 1 because that's when the FDA has to approve it for studying in humans. And so that process, that can take a long time. It could be even years in some cases. So it's slow.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's see. That's okay. How about this? If you see a study for yourself, but you don't quite fit the criteria, say the study is a phase 4 and this person is in phase 3, is it still worth pursuing, or would you be absolutely excluded?
Yeah, so the study criteria are very strict. There will be no exceptions. Like, for example, if the study says your hemoglobin has to be 10, that's a measure of your blood count, and your hemoglobin is 9.9, they're not rounding up for you. And it's harsh, right? And I can't tell you how many people I've had to not put on study for something so minor, and you've tried and you do everything and it doesn't go on. And the reason is that the clinical trial data has to be clean. They have to have a very clear, uniform population to measure efficacy, and they have to draw lines in the sand somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. Is a patient with a 9.9 going to do any worse than 10? No. And you just want to rip your hair out because you can't put them on the study, but they do not make exceptions. And so I think it's good to know what's out there, but if you're not eligible, the question I would ask your oncologist is, am I not eligible right now? And maybe I'll be eligible at some point, or is this study out for me, completely?
And something else I would say is it's almost like when you're trying to find a clinical trial and looking at that criteria, like when you're told, no, you don't meet that criteria, it's almost like dating, like, God, that date just did not go well, or why are they not calling me back, or something like that. But still encourage you to keep looking or keep asking your care team, keep trying, don't let one denial, throw you off.
And just because this study with, let's say, immunotherapy is not right for you, that's not the only immunotherapy. There's going to be another study with a different immunotherapy that maybe you can go on. So keep looking and keep being optimistic.
Oh my goodness. Dr. Teplinsky, this was a highly, highly informative and fantastic program. Thank you so much. And thank you all who joined today and for submitting fantastic questions. I mean, we still have so many more questions. So for those who we didn't get to, we hope maybe in some of the discussion that it might have answered a little bit. But also, everyone, please make sure to check out our upcoming programs. Feel free to share these programs with your communities. Your friends and family are all welcome to attend. You do not have to have a cancer diagnosis to attend one of these webinars because it is about education and empowering. So make sure to follow us also on social media as well. And right after this, please take a moment to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. The survey will pop up in the browser when the webinar ends, and the link will also be sent in the follow-up email. And just know all surveys are anonymous. Again, everyone, thank you so much. This concludes our webinar. Thank you again, Dr. Teplinsky, and we'll see you next time.
Guys.